The story of Stoicism is told as a conversation between great men. We know the names Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius as if they were the only voices that mattered in an entire philosophy of resilience. But what if that story is incomplete? By the end of this exploration, you will discover a hidden lineage of resilience that fundamentally changes how we see this ancient wisdom. We are not adding new characters to the historical record. We are recovering the ones that were always there, waiting in the fragments of letters and the shadows of great events. Who were the Roman women who lived by Stoic principles, and why did history try so hard to forget them? This erasure was not an accident of time, but a feature of the Roman society was built on a foundation of patriarchy, a structure so complete it shaped not just laws and households, but the very recording of history itself. The men who wrote the chronicles of their age, men like Tacitus or Pliny the Younger, were writing for an audience of other powerful men. Their focus was the Senate, the military campaigns, the philosophical debates in the public square, spheres from which women were formally excluded. A woman's intellectual life, her private counsel, her personal practice of philosophy, simply did not register as history in the traditional sense. It was considered part of the domestic world, unworthy of the scroll. Yet the evidence did not vanish entirely. It survives in the quiet margins of those very same texts. It is there in a passing compliment within a letter, a grateful dedication on a stone inscription, or a record of a generous donation made in a woman's name. We find hints of their Stoicism not in published treatises, but in the personal correspondence of the famous men they influenced. The story of these women is therefore a detective story. Modern scholars must become literary archaeologists, sifting through these fragments, reading between the lines of a sentence, and connecting scattered clues across different sources. They are piecing together a mosaic where many of the original tiles have been lost, relying on the shape of the empty spaces to understand the full picture. This makes every recovered name, every attributed action, a small victory against that historical silence. To reconstruct these lives, historians work like detectives with a very specific set of clues. Their primary evidence often comes from the personal letters of the Stoic men themselves. Think of the collected correspondence of Seneca or Pliny the Younger not as polished philosophy, but as a window into their private worlds. Within these intimate messages, written to offer comfort, advice, or simply share news, women appear as active participants in philosophical discussion. A man like Seneca does not write a long letter explaining Stoic principles about grief to his mother, Helvia, unless he believes she is capable of understanding them. He is not lecturing a passive listener. He is engaging with an intellectual peer on the most painful subject imaginable. The letter itself becomes proof of her philosophical literacy. Similarly, when Pliny the Younger writes with profound admiration about the courage of his young wife, Calpurnia, during his illness, he is documenting her stoic composure in real time. These are not historical narratives about women. They are private moments that accidentally reveal their strength. Beyond letters, other fragments of everyday Roman life offer silent testimony. Funerary inscriptions carved in stone to honor a life can be surprisingly eloquent. While many simply list family relations, some celebrate a woman's character using distinctly philosophical language, praising her wisdom, her integrity, or her unwavering courage. Legal documents and records of property ownership can also shed light, showing women who managed complex estates or made significant public donations, actions that required the practical wisdom and rational judgment Stoicism prized. The challenge for modern scholars is to read these sources with a critical eye. They must look past the woman being described as a daughter, a wife, or a mother, the standard Roman categories, and ask what the description implies about her mind and her choices. When a source says a woman bore hardship with patience, is that just a cultural cliché, or is it evidence of a conscious philosophical practice? The answer often lies in the details and the context. This meticulous work of recovery brings us to our first major figure, a woman who emerges from the shadows with remarkable clarity precisely because of the crisis that surrounded her. Her name was Arria, and her story was recorded not by a historian of philosophy, but by Pliny the Younger, who heard it from his mentor. Arria was the wife of a Roman senator named Paetus, who was involved in a failed rebellion against the Emperor Claudius. The penalty for such treason was death. When Paetus was imprisoned and awaiting execution, he was understandably terrified. Arria, determined that her husband meet his end with dignity, became his stoic anchor. She famously starved herself alongside him in solidarity, and when he wavered, she demonstrated the ultimate act of philosophical conviction. Taking a dagger, she stabbed herself, pulled it from her chest, and handed it to her husband, saying, "Paetus, it does not hurt." Arria's story is one of legendary courage, but it exists at the extreme edge of crisis. For a clearer picture of daily Stoic partnership, we must look to a quieter, more sustained example. This brings us to Pompeia Paulina, the wife of Seneca the Younger. Unlike Arria, Paulina is not defined by a single dramatic moment, though she would face one. She emerges from Seneca's own writings as a constant presence, a fellow traveler on the philosophical path. In his letters, particularly those addressed to his friend Lucilius, Seneca occasionally offers glimpses into his domestic life, and Paulina is there, not as a background figure, but as an integral part of his practice. He writes of their shared meals, their conversations, and how her presence steadies him. He describes her not as a pupil he is instructing, but as a companion whose own moral strength he admires and relies upon. This was a marriage, it seems, built as much on shared intellectual commitment as on affection. Seneca explicitly credits her with helping him simplify his life, to reduce distractions and focus on what truly mattered according to Stoic teaching. Her influence was practical and profound, guiding him toward the very austerity he preached. This paints a portrait of a collaborative philosophical life, where wisdom was cultivated together within the home, far from the public eye of the Roman Forum. The ultimate test of this shared philosophy, however, would come at the very end of Seneca's life, when the Emperor Nero, once Seneca's student, turned against him and ordered his death. Seneca was compelled to take his own life. The historian Tacitus provides a detailed account of this scene, and Paulina is central to it. Upon hearing the sentence, she insisted on sharing her husband's fate. This was not a sudden impulse of grief, but a deliberate, reasoned choice made from a place of profound philosophical unity. Seneca, initially agreeing, cut her wrists alongside his own. Yet the narrative takes a turn that is deeply revealing. When Nero's soldiers, perhaps alarmed by the potential scandal of a noblewoman's death, intervened and bound Paulina's wounds, she survived. Tacitus notes that she lived on for several years, preserving to the end a dignified loyalty to her husband's memory. This conclusion is crucial. It shows that Paulina's Stoicism was not solely about the grand, final act of defiance, but about the enduring commitment to live with principle afterward. Her choice to die with Seneca was a Stoic act of solidarity and freedom. Her compelled survival and her subsequent life lived with honor was perhaps an even more demanding Stoic practice. She demonstrated that the philosophy was not just about how one meets an end, but about how one continues, bearing loss with a steady mind. Paulina exemplifies the Stoic partner, a woman whose practice was so interwoven with her husband's that it became the fabric of their shared existence, visible in both their daily routines and their final, terrible hour. The dedication of a philosophical work is never a casual gesture. When Seneca addressed his essay on the happy life to his wife Paulina, he was doing something radical for his time. He was formally inviting a woman into a public philosophical conversation, recognizing her not just as his spouse, but as his intended reader and judge. The essay itself is a guide to achieving a flourishing life through virtue and reason, the core of Stoic ethics. By placing Paulina's name at its beginning, Seneca was making a profound statement. He was asserting that the pursuit of wisdom, the central project of a Stoic life, was as much her domain as it was his. This was not a private love letter, it was a philosophical partnership made visible. Within the text, Seneca argues that true happiness comes from living in accordance with nature and virtue, a state accessible to anyone who cultivates reason. By dedicating this argument to Paulina, he implicitly credits her with understanding it, and perhaps even with embodying its principles. It transforms their relationship from a private bond into a shared philosophical mission, with the home as their school and their daily life as their practice. This context makes the final scene of their lives, recorded by the historian Tacitus, not merely a tragic love story, but a complex Stoic drama played out in real time. When the emperor's death sentence arrives, Paulina immediately insists on sharing her husband's fate. From a conventional Roman perspective, this could be seen as wifely devotion, but from a Stoic viewpoint, it is something far more significant. It is a rational choice, a final act of solidarity, and a declaration of her own freedom. She is exercising her proherses, her reasoned will, choosing a noble end over a life under a tyrant's shadow. Seneca, in that moment, agrees. Yet when the act is underway and the soldiers intervene to save Paulina, the drama deepens. Seneca, weakened but still rational, argues for her to live. He pleads with her to endure, to bear the loss and continue on. This is not a contradiction, but a heartbreaking evolution of their shared philosophy. His initial agreement honored her autonomous choice. His subsequent plea recognized a different aspect of Stoic duty, the duty to endure hardship with courage if fate dictates it. He was, in essence, guiding her toward the harder path, the path of living with principle after profound loss. Paulina's survival and her subsequent years lived with dignity complete this case study. She becomes the ultimate example of a Roman matron applying Stoic ethics not in the abstract, but in the crushing reality of personal and political catastrophe. Her story moves from the shared pursuit of the happy life to the coordinated acceptance of a noble death, and finally to the solitary, steadfast commitment to live well afterward. She demonstrates that Stoic resilience is not a single grand gesture, but a continuum of choices, each requiring profound strength of character. In Paulina, we see the philosophy made flesh, not in the speeches of a senator, but in the quiet fortitude of a woman history nearly overlooked. While Paulina's story unfolded within the walls of her home and the confines of a personal crisis, other Stoic women took their principles directly into the political arena, where the stakes were the fate of the Roman state itself. Among them, Fannia stands as a towering figure of resistance. She was no philosopher writing treatises, but a practitioner whose life became a living manifesto against tyranny. Her identity was forged in fire as the daughter of the renowned Stoic senator Thrasea Paetus and the wife of another Stoic firebrand, Helvidius Priscus. To understand Fania is to understand a family business, and that business was principled opposition. In an era where emperors like Nero and later Domitian demanded absolute loyalty and sycophantic praise, her father Thrasea made a quiet, devastating protest. He simply stopped attending the Senate. He refused to participate in a system he saw as corrupt, withdrawing his consent in a powerful act of Stoic indifference to external honors and a profound commitment to internal virtue. This was not a call for revolution, but a moral stance that the ruling powers found intolerably subversive. For this silent defiance, Thrasea was sentenced to death. His final hours, spent in philosophical discussion with friends before taking his own life, became legendary among Stoics, a model of meeting injustice with calm resolve. Fannia witnessed this. She absorbed not just the philosophy from her father, but the unimaginable cost of living it. This inheritance did not make her retreat from public life, it propelled her into it. She married Helvidius Priscus, a man who shared her father's convictions and took opposition even further, openly criticizing the Emperor Vespasian for overstepping his power. The pattern repeated. Helvidius was eventually executed, and Fannia, now linked by blood and marriage to two of Rome's most famous dissidents, became a target herself. Her life became a cycle of exile and return. Under the paranoid Emperor Domitian, she was banished from Rome not once, but multiple times for the crime of preserving and honoring the writings of her executed husband. The authorities demanded she erase his memory, to let his ideas and his defiance be forgotten. She refused. In preserving his words, she was preserving the very principle that had guided both him and her father, the Stoic belief that one must act with integrity regardless of the consequence. Each exile was a brutal punishment, a severing from home and status, yet each return demonstrated her unbroken spirit. Fannia's courage was not the dramatic, single-gesture kind of Arria, but a long, grinding resilience. It was the courage to endure repeated punishment, to remain a symbol of a banned political legacy, and to carry the flame of her family's Stoic conviction through decades of oppression. Her story reframes Stoic political resistance. It was not solely the domain of senators making speeches. It was also upheld by the women who maintained the households of those senators, who safeguarded their writings when it was illegal to do so, and who endured the repercussions with a steadfastness that was itself a profound political act. Fannia lived the Stoic paradox, finding a form of freedom in repeated persecution, her identity so rooted in virtue that no emperor could truly take it from her. Domitian's reign of fear finally ended with his passing, but for Fannia, survival was only the first step. Having endured repeated exile for safeguarding her family's banned legacy, she now faced a different challenge, the work of memory. In the quieter years that followed, an older and wearied Fannia made a decision of immense historical consequence. She carefully gathered the most precious documents in her possession, the personal papers of her mother, Arria, and the writings of her executed husband, Helvidius Priscus. She then entrusted them not to a fellow senator or a famous philosopher, but to a younger man known for his integrity and his skilled pen, Pliny the Younger. This was not a casual loan of old letters. It was a deliberate act of intellectual stewardship, a passing of the torch from one who had lived the resistance to one who could faithfully record it. Pliny, who had admired her family from afar and despised the tyranny of Domitian, accepted this sacred commission. Using these first-hand accounts, he later wrote biographies of both Arria and Helvidius, texts that, though lost to us now, were read by his contemporaries and shaped the historical record for generations. Through this single act, Fannia ensured that the Stoic defiance of her family would not be erased by their enemies. She understood that victory was not just in outliving a tyrant, but in controlling the story told after he was gone. By choosing her historian carefully, she guaranteed that the principles of courage and integrity, demonstrated by both a mother's legendary resolve and a husband's political fortitude, would become part of Rome's moral memory. Her legacy, therefore, is twofold. She was a living exemplar of Stoic endurance, and she became the archivist who made sure such examples were not forgotten. This transforms her from a passive victim of history into an active shaper of it. She moved from preserving papers in secret to commissioning their public telling, guiding how future Romans would understand what it meant to stand against power with principle. In Fannia, we see the complete Stoic life cycle of resistance, from the fiery defiance of youth, through the grinding perseverance of exile, to the wise, strategic curation of legacy in old age. Her story asks us to consider where true power ultimately lies. Is it in the hand that signs the death sentence, or in the hand that carefully passes the documents to the one who will write the history? Arria the Elder lived before Stoicism became a household word in Rome, yet her story became a foundational myth for the philosophy. She was the matriarch of that formidable family of dissenters, the mother-in-law to Thracia Paetus and the grandmother to Fannia. Her defining moment arrived not in a philosophical debate, but in a cold prison cell, a scene so stark it would echo through Roman memory for centuries. Her husband, the senator Caecina Paetus, had been implicated in a failed rebellion and was condemned to die by his own hand. Facing this sentence, Paetus faltered, his courage failing him. What happened next was recorded by Pliny the Younger, who heard the tale from Arria's own descendants. Seeing her husband's terror, Arria took the dagger intended for him and, without a word of warning, plunged it into her own chest. She then withdrew the blade, handed it to her stunned husband, and spoke the three immortal words, Pete non dolet, Paetus, it does not hurt. This is not a story of despair, but a calculated lesson in courage. Arria's act was a radical demonstration of what it means to master one's perception of pain and fear. In that single, shocking gesture, she performed a kind of living philosophy. She showed that physical suffering could be separated from mental anguish, that the body's sensation could be met with the mind's resolve. She redefined the moment for her husband, transforming his impending death from an occasion of paralyzing terror into an opportunity for dignified action. By showing him it could be done without flinching, she gave him the blueprint for his own end. Later Stoic writers, including Seneca and the historians who admired the family, would look back on Arria and see in her the perfect embodiment of their core ideals. Here was a person confronting the ultimate external hardship, the end of life itself, with unwavering rationality and courage. She exercised complete control over her reaction, displaying the virtue of fortitude in its most absolute form. Her legend was adopted and celebrated precisely because it was not a theoretical argument about enduring hardship. It was a visceral, unforgettable proof that it could be done. Arria became a pre-Stoic prototype, a figure whose raw example was later clothed in philosophical language. Her legacy provided a powerful ancestral anchor for the Stoic resistance of her son-in-law and granddaughter, a living reminder that the strength to face tyranny did not emerge from nowhere. It was inherited, a fierce family tradition of meeting injustice with a calm mind and an unyielding heart. Her story asks us to consider where true philosophy truly resides. Is it only in the written texts and formal arguments, or can it also be found in the silent, decisive actions of those who teach us how to face our darkest hours without blinking? The legend of Arria the Elder was not an isolated act of courage, but the seed from which an entire garden of Stoic resistance would grow. Her daughter, known to history as Arria the Younger, inherited more than just a name. She inherited a household that would become a living school for dissent, a quiet headquarters for the Stoic opposition in Rome. It is easy for the historical record to blur the two Arrias, mother and daughter, into a single archetype of fierce Roman womanhood. But the younger Arria's contribution was different. While her mother defined herself in one legendary moment, the younger Arria defined herself through a lifetime of sustained cultivation. Her role was not as the lone heroine, but as the matriarch of a philosophical community. She married Thracia Paetus, the senator whose quiet withdrawal from public life under Nero became the most potent political statement a Stoic could make. Together, they did not merely practice philosophy in private, they built an entire ecosystem around it. Their home became a renowned hub, a salon where the leading minds of the Stoic opposition could gather, debate, and find solidarity. Imagine the conversations in those rooms, away from the spies and the sycophants of the imperial court. Here, Thracia could discuss the nature of justice with his peers, while Arria managed the household not just as a domestic space, but as a safe harbor for dangerous ideas. This environment was the crucible in which the next generation's convictions were forged. Their daughter was Fannia, who would later endure exile with such resolve. Their son-in-law was Helvidius Priscus, who would take Thracia's mantle of opposition and carry it even further. The values were not passed down through stern lectures, but through osmosis, through witnessing a life lived in unwavering alignment with principle. The younger Aria provided the stable, intelligent center from which this network of resistance radiated. She was the keeper of the flame her mother had lit, ensuring it did not flare out in a single brilliant moment, but burned steadily, warming and illuminating all who gathered around it. Her legacy is the legacy of the circle, the understanding that philosophy gains its real power not in solitude, but in community, and that the most subversive ideas are often nurtured not in the Senate house, but around the family hearth. The philosophy of principled resistance was not confined to the homes of senators like Thracia Petus. It also found a place within the very heart of the power it often opposed, the imperial palace itself. Here, Stoicism presented a different kind of challenge, not as a tool for dissent, but as a framework for personal integrity within a gilded cage. The first hints of this appear generations earlier with Octavia, the beloved sister of Rome's first emperor, Augustus. While we have no direct writings from Octavia, the historical record suggests she was surrounded by Stoic influences. Her brother's closest advisor was a Stoic philosopher named Athenodorus, and the cultural atmosphere Augustus cultivated emphasized duty, piety, and self-control, values that resonated deeply with Stoic ethics. Octavia herself became an icon of Roman feminine virtue, enduring profound personal losses, including the death of her son, with a legendary dignity. While we cannot definitively call her a Stoic, her life was shaped by the same philosophical currents that would later produce Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. She demonstrates how these ideas permeated the highest levels of society, offering a model of composed resilience even for those living in the spotlight of ultimate power. A far clearer and more poignant example emerges a century and a half later, from within the most famously philosophical imperial family in history. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, author of the Meditations, did not cultivate his wisdom in isolation. He was part of a family, and that family included his sister, Annia Cornificia Faustina Minor. While Marcus's writings focus on his own inner life, the scattered references to his sister paint a portrait of a woman who shared his philosophical heritage. As a child in the household of their grandfather, she would have received the same elite education as her brother, an education steeped in rhetoric and undoubtedly in Stoic thought. She was not merely related to a philosopher, she was raised in the same intellectual environment that produced one. This shared foundation became her anchor during the brutal turmoil that followed the reign of their brother, the Emperor Lucius Verus, and later her own nephew, the unstable Commodus. The Antonine dynasty, after generations of stable succession, descended into suspicion and violence under Commodus's paranoia. Family members were seen as threats, and many were eliminated. It is here, in the shadow of the imperial executioner, that Annia Cornificia's philosophical bearing becomes visible. Historical accounts note that when the sentence of death finally came for her, she met it not with desperation, but with a chilling, dignified composure. She is said to have performed the traditional rituals of her household gods, then faced her end with a calm resolve that directly echoes the Stoic teachings on accepting what one cannot control. Her final words, as reported, were a pointed reflection on her famous brother. She remarked that her soul would now be a companion to his, a man who had, in her view, been deified not by an emperor's decree, but by his own virtue. This was not the cry of a victim, but the considered statement of a philosopher. She asserted the superiority of moral character over political power, even as that political power took her life. In her, we see the ultimate test of a Stoic education applied not to the problems of ruling an empire, but to the personal crisis of losing one's life to it. Her story completes a profound circle, showing that the same principles that guided Marcus Aurelius in his meditations on duty also guided his sister in her final, solitary moment of courage. The philosophy was a family inheritance, and she proved herself a worthy heir. Musonia Rufina is a name history barely whispers. We know her only as the mother of Gaius Musonius Rufus, a Stoic philosopher so influential he was called the Roman Socrates. Yet in that single fact, a profound truth lies hidden. Before a man became a philosopher, he was a child, and in the world of Roman elite education, the first and most enduring teachers were often mothers. The values that would later blossom into a full Stoic life discipline, respect for reason, a sense of duty, were seeds planted not in the lecture hall but in the home by women like Musonia Rufina. Their instruction was informal, woven into the fabric of daily life. A mother correcting a child's behavior, explaining a point of honor, or modeling composure during a family difficulty was conducting a masterclass in ethics long before any formal tutor arrived. This early moral formation was the essential groundwork. A young Musonius Rufus did not encounter the idea of enduring hardship with patience for the first time in a philosophical text. He likely absorbed it through observing how his mother managed the household, handled setbacks, or spoke about character. Her influence shaped the very soil in which later philosophical seeds could take deep root. Think of it this way: philosophy often deals with abstract principles like justice or courage, but a child first understands these concepts in concrete, personal terms. Is it fair to take a sibling's toy? What does it mean to be brave when you are frightened? The answers a mother provides in those moments create the initial framework for understanding the world, a framework that a philosopher like Musonius Rufus would later refine and systematize. So while we have no letters from Musonia Rufina, no recorded sayings, her legacy is written in the character of her son and in the values he spent his life teaching. She represents the countless unnamed women who performed the quiet, essential labor of crafting the moral raw material from which Rome's great thinkers were formed. Their classrooms had no walls, their lessons left no scrolls, but their impact echoes through the centuries in the lives of the men history remembers. This quiet, foundational role of mothers finds its most vocal champion in the son of Musonia Rufina himself. While his mother's teachings were private, Musonius Rufus took the principles she embodied and declared them publicly, with a clarity that still feels radical centuries later. In a world where women were often seen as intellectually inferior, Musonius stood before his students and argued with relentless logic for their absolute equality in the pursuit of wisdom. His surviving lectures, especially one titled "That Women Too Should Study Philosophy," are not gentle suggestions. They are a systematic dismantling of prejudice, built on the core Stoic belief that virtue is the same for all rational beings. He begins with a simple, powerful premise. If virtue is the excellence of a human being and women are human beings, then they are equally capable of achieving it. Courage, justice, wisdom, and self-control, these are not masculine or feminine traits. They are human traits. A woman shows courage not on a battlefield, but in managing a household with fairness, in raising children with discipline, or in facing illness with fortitude. The virtue is identical, only the circumstances differ. Musonius then tackles the practical objections of his time head-on. Some argued that philosophy would make women neglect their domestic duties. He counters this with brilliant Stoic reasoning. Studying philosophy, he insists, would make women better at those very duties. A woman trained in justice would manage her household and servants more fairly. A woman practiced in self-control would handle the family resources more wisely. A woman who understood courage would raise braver children. For Musonius, philosophy was not an escape from one's role, it was the tool to perform that role with excellence. He even argued that both husbands and wives should study philosophy together, creating a harmonious partnership based on shared reason rather than mere custom or emotion. This was a vision of the household as a miniature republic of virtue, where each member, through philosophical practice, contributed to the common good. His arguments extended to the nature of education itself. He pointed out that both boys and girls are taught to read and write, skills for the mind. Why, then, should they not both be taught to train their character, the most important skill of all? To deny women philosophy, in his view, was to deny them the means to fully realize their humanity. Musonius Rufus, therefore, provides the philosophical backbone for every story we have recovered. He gives us the language to understand why a Paulina could be Seneca's partner in wisdom, why a Fania could endure exile with principled resolve, and why a mother like his own could shape a philosopher's soul. He moves the conversation from hidden influence to open declaration, from what women did in practice to why they had every right to do it in principle. In his voice, Stoicism reaches one of its most inclusive and revolutionary conclusions, that the light of reason knows no gender. Musonius Rufus offered a powerful ideal, but ideals exist in tension with reality. To understand his true impact, we must ask a simple question. Did his revolutionary ideas actually change anything for the women of his time? Or did they remain beautiful theories discussed only among a small circle of students? The evidence suggests a complex answer, one that lies somewhere between radical theory and quiet, practical influence. It is unlikely that his lectures sparked a widespread social movement for women's education. The legal and cultural structures of Rome were simply too entrenched. A woman's primary identity was still defined by her role as daughter, wife, and mother. Her legal rights were limited, and her public life was heavily circumscribed. Musonius was not a political reformer trying to change laws. He was a philosopher trying to change minds, one student at a time. His real-world impact, therefore, was not societal but personal and relational. It happened in the lives of the specific women who studied with him or were influenced by his students. We know he had female pupils, a fact remarkable enough for later writers to mention. While their names are mostly lost, they represent a direct line from his theory to their practice. For these women, his teachings were not abstract. They were a toolkit for navigating a world that offered them little formal power. His philosophy of virtue provided a profound inner authority. If a woman could cultivate justice, then she could argue for fair treatment within her household. If she practiced courage, she could face family crises or social disapproval with steadiness. If she valued wisdom, she could make sound decisions about managing property or advising her husband, all from a position of reasoned principle rather than emotion or custom. This internal empowerment was perhaps the most significant practical outcome. A Stoic woman, following Musonius's guidance, could find a form of freedom not in overthrowing her social role, but in fulfilling it with unparalleled excellence and autonomy. She could transform the domestic sphere from a cage of duty into an arena for virtuous action. The contrast, however, was always present. Outside the philosophical schoolroom, Roman gender norms celebrated different qualities: public modesty, loyalty to family, and fertility. A woman who was too openly intellectual risked ridicule or suspicion. The ideal Roman matron was praised for her silence, not her dialectical skills. Musonius's vision directly challenged this by insisting that a woman's mind was her most important attribute. This created a fascinating duality for his followers. They likely lived two parallel lives: the external life of conforming to societal expectations, and the rich internal life of a philosophical practitioner. Their Stoicism became a private source of strength, a lens through which to interpret their duties and hardships not as burdens, but as opportunities to exercise virtue. In this way, Musonius's ideas were both adopted and contained. They empowered individuals but did not dismantle systems. They provided a language of inner dignity that could make the constraints of the outer world more bearable and perhaps even meaningful. The legacy of his teaching is found not in changed laws, but in the quiet resilience of unknown women who met their appointed roles not with passive acceptance, but with the active, reasoned commitment of a philosopher. The imperial palace could be a gilded prison, but it could also become an unexpected platform for philosophical advocacy. While the Stoic opposition challenged emperors from the outside, other imperial women worked from within the very center of power to shape the intellectual landscape of the empire itself. Pompeia Plotina, the wife of the Emperor Trajan, provides a fascinating case study. Her legacy is not one of dramatic resistance, but of quiet, effective patronage. History remembers her as a woman of sober dignity, admired for her modest lifestyle even as empress, but her true passion lay not in politics, but in philosophy, specifically the teachings of Epicurus. This is a crucial detail. Plotina was not promoting Stoicism, the philosophy often associated with Roman duty, but a rival school that emphasized tranquility, friendship, and the pursuit of modest pleasures free from fear. Her engagement shows that imperial women were not merely passive symbols, they were active participants in the philosophical debates of their age, capable of choosing a school of thought that resonated with their own vision of the good life. Plotina's influence reached its peak following Trajan's passing. She played a key role in ensuring the smooth succession of Hadrian, and it was with this newly secured influence that she turned her attention to Athens, the ancient heart of philosophical learning. There, she intervened directly in the affairs of the Epicurean school. The school's leadership had become restricted, open only to Roman citizens. Plotina successfully petitioned Hadrian to change the rules, arguing that the head of the school should be chosen based on merit and philosophical attainment, not citizenship. She won. This was not a minor administrative tweak, it was a profound act of intellectual stewardship. By opening the succession to the most qualified philosopher, regardless of origin, she helped preserve the integrity and continuity of an entire tradition. Her letters on the matter, which survive in part, reveal a woman of clear reasoning and firm conviction, wielding her immense social capital not for personal gain, but for the health of a philosophical community she cherished. Plotina demonstrates that a woman's philosophical engagement could take a powerfully public form, shaping institutions and ensuring that the conversation of wisdom remained open to the most worthy voices. If Plotina used her position to champion a school, her successor as empress seemed to find little solace in any formal doctrine. Vibia Sabina, the wife of the Emperor Hadrian, presents a more enigmatic and poignant figure. Married to one of Rome's most complex and peripatetic rulers, her life was one of immense external luxury and constant travel, shadowed by persistent rumors of a deeply unhappy marriage. The historical sources are sparse and often hostile, but they consistently paint a picture of a woman at odds with her glittering circumstances. While we cannot know her inner thoughts, her reported demeanor and choices invite interpretation through a Stoic lens, specifically the quest for inner freedom amidst external bondage. Sabina accompanied Hadrian on his vast journeys across the empire, from the cold frontiers of Britain to the ancient sands of Egypt. She was present for the grand ceremonies and the architectural marvels her husband commissioned, yet contemporary whispers suggested she found no joy in it. One ancient historian even claims she said she had deliberately avoided having children with Hadrian lest they turn out like him. This statement, whether truly hers or not, reflects a perception of her as someone who felt trapped. From a Stoic perspective, Sabina's life becomes a stark study in the dichotomy of control. She had no control over her marriage, her public duties, or the relentless itinerary of her husband's reign. These were externals imposed upon her, but the rumors of her dissatisfaction, her alleged coldness toward Hadrian, and her possible retreat into a private world of her own could be seen as forms of inner resistance. In a world where she could not change her circumstances, the only freedom left was the freedom of her own judgment and attitude. The Stoic ideal of apatheia, not as emotionlessness but as freedom from destructive passions, might have been the only sanctuary available to her. Her eventual passing before Hadrian's own, and the faint suggestion that she may have taken her own life, casts the longest shadow. If true, this final, desperate act could be misinterpreted as a failure of philosophy. Yet, viewed through the harsh light of her reality, it might also be seen as the ultimate, tragic assertion of control over the one thing she felt she still commanded, her own existence. Sabina's story reminds us that for every woman who could openly advocate for a school like Plotina, there were others for whom philosophy was not an academic pursuit, but a silent, daily struggle for a sense of self within a cage of gold. Her imagined Stoicism is not one of joyful practice, but of sheer endurance, a search for an inner citadel when the outer world offered no peace. The Vestal Virgins occupied a space in Roman society that was both revered and profoundly separate. Chosen as young girls from noble families, they pledged 30 years of service to the goddess Vesta, guardian of Rome's sacred hearth. Their duty was to maintain the eternal flame in her temple, a symbol of the city's very life and continuity. In exchange for this sacred office, they were granted privileges no other Roman woman possessed: legal independence, the right to own property, and the power to pardon condemned prisoners. Yet the cost of this unique status was a life of extraordinary discipline. They took a vow of chastity for their 3 decades of service, and any breach of this vow was considered a direct threat to the safety of the state, punishable by a fate we will discuss only in its historical context. Their entire existence was a ritual of control, from the meticulous tending of the flame to the strict regulation of their own bodies and behavior. It is here, in the architecture of their lives, that we find a startling parallel to Stoic practice, not in studied texts but in lived asceticism. The Vestal's life demanded a complete detachment from the personal ambitions of a typical Roman matron: marriage, children, a private household. Her identity was subsumed into a higher duty, the welfare of Rome itself. This mirrors the Stoic ideal of living in accordance with a greater nature, of subordinating personal desires to a rational, cosmic order. The self-control required to maintain their ritual purity for decades echoes the Stoic discipline of mastering one's impulses and emotions. Their famed composure in public ceremony was a performance of apatheia, that freedom from disruptive passions. While they were priestesses, not philosophers, the structure of their vocation cultivated a Stoic-like character through sheer, relentless practice. The question then becomes, did any Vestal ever step beyond this ritual framework to engage with philosophy as an intellectual pursuit? The historical record offers one tantalizing, if ambiguous, possibility. A Vestal virgin named Claudia is noted in an inscription for her exceptional character and learning. While the inscription does not specify philosophical study, the praise for her prudentia, or practical wisdom, and her overall cultivation hints at an education that went beyond the purely religious. In a world where elite women were increasingly engaging with philosophical ideas, it is not difficult to imagine a Vestal, with her unique freedom from domestic demands, having the time and access to engage with texts or tutors. More broadly, their very existence demonstrates that philosophy is not confined to lecture halls. The Vestals embodied a form of philosophical ascesis, or training, through their daily rituals. Their vow was a lifelong commitment to a principle greater than themselves. Their detachment from family was a radical form of cosmopolitanism, seeing Rome itself as their only family. In this light, the institution of the Vestals can be seen as a kind of unwitting, state-sponsored monastery for a particular brand of Roman virtue, one that shared profound territory with the Stoic project of building an unshakable self through discipline and duty. Their story expands our understanding of where wisdom was cultivated in the ancient world, reminding us that sometimes the most rigorous philosophical training wore the robes of a priestess, not the cloak of a scholar. This quiet, practical support could be just as revolutionary as a public lecture, for while philosophers spoke of virtue, they still needed bread and a roof. In the volatile landscape of imperial Rome, where an emperor's disfavor could mean exile or worse, this basic need for security opened a powerful avenue for influence. Wealthy women of standing, often widows who controlled their own finances, stepped into this role not as students but as patrons and protectors. Their contribution was less about personal fame and more about creating the conditions for philosophy itself to survive and flourish. Think of it as a form of intellectual gardening. A male philosopher might plant the seed of an idea, but it was the female patron who provided the sheltered greenhouse, the steady nourishment, and the protective wall against the political frost. This was a deeply pragmatic power. A woman like Marcella, a friend of the philosopher Seneca, could offer her country villa as a refuge, a quiet place for writing and thought away from the intrigues of the capital. Her home became a sanctuary where dangerous ideas could be discussed safely, far from the ears of imperial informers. This was not merely hospitality, it was a calculated risk, a declaration of allegiance to a certain way of thinking. By offering shelter, a patroness was effectively endorsing the philosopher's work and sharing in the potential repercussions. Her social status acted as a shield, making it more difficult for authorities to move against someone under her protection. Her network of connections could provide early warnings of political danger or help smooth over disputes. This role extended beyond crisis management into the very economics of knowledge. Philosophy was not a lucrative profession. Teachers relied on gifts, fees from students, or the support of a wealthy benefactor to sustain their work. A woman of means could provide a steady income, fund the copying of scrolls, or even support an entire school. This financial backing allowed thinkers the precious commodity of time to write, to teach, and to refine their arguments without being forced into more profitable but distracting work. In this way, a patroness did not just protect a philosopher, she invested in the future of his ideas. She enabled the production of the texts that would later be read for centuries. Her legacy was woven into the pages she helped bring into existence, even if her name was never inscribed upon them. This form of influence was perfectly aligned with the social expectations of elite Roman women, who are often praised for their piety and generosity. Supporting a philosopher could be framed as a noble act of patronage, a cultural contribution that brought honor to her family. Yet beneath this conventional surface, it was a profoundly subversive act. It meant that a woman, operating within the accepted channels of aristocratic duty, was directly deciding which strands of thought received the resources to endure. When political winds shifted and a philosopher faced persecution, the choice to continue that support, to hide him or fund his exile, transformed patronage into an act of moral courage. It was a quiet, steadfast vote of confidence in a vision of the world that often challenged the very power structures that had given her wealth in the first place. These women understood that ideas need ecosystems to live, and they dedicated their resources to building and defending those ecosystems. Their story shifts our focus from the lone genius to the network that sustained him, reminding us that behind every scroll that survived the centuries, there was often not just a writer, but a silent partner who believed his words were worth the risk. The personal letter was the social media of the Roman elite, a private network where ideas could travel with an intimacy the public forum could never provide. For the women we have been following, these letters were more than mere correspondence. They were the primary classroom, the counseling session, and the philosophical proving ground. In the scrolls exchanged between friends and family, we find the clearest evidence that women were not just passive recipients of wisdom, but active participants in a living dialogue. The public square may have been barred to them, but the written word opened a back door to a vibrant intellectual life. Consider the letters of Seneca to his wife, Paulina. When he writes to console her during his exile or to reflect on the nature of happiness, he is not delivering a monologue. The very act of addressing her on such profound topics presupposes a listener capable of complex understanding. In one famous letter, he describes how the sight of her courage steels his own spirit during a period of political danger. He writes, "Your courage has been my great encouragement. You have rallied my failing strength." This is not a husband praising a wife for mere loyalty. It is a philosopher acknowledging a peer whose ethical fortitude actively sustains his own practice. He is documenting a reciprocal relationship where her lived stoicism becomes a source of his philosophical resilience. The letter format itself creates a space of relative equality. Freed from the performative demands of the Senate or the lecture hall, Seneca writes to Paulina as a companion on the same path, sharing struggles and insights as one seeker to another. This private medium allowed for a candor and a mutual recognition that the rigid hierarchies of public life would have stifled. A similar dynamic unfolds in the correspondence of Pliny the Younger. His letters, carefully curated for publication, offer a window into the intellectual circles of his day, and women are consistently present within them. He writes with deep respect to his mother-in-law, Pompeia Paulina, about managing property, displaying his trust in her practical judgment. Most tellingly, in his letters about his third wife, Calpurnia, he paints a portrait of a collaborative partnership. He describes how she reads his speeches and offers feedback, how she sets his writings to music, and how she anxiously follows his career from afar when they are separated. He recounts a period of serious illness, noting that her devotion and strength were a profound comfort. Pliny is not just listing a wife's dutiful attributes, he is cataloging the behaviors of an intellectual partner. Her engagement with his work, her emotional resilience, and her capacity for reasoned concern all point to a mind trained to value and support a life of public service and letters. In one poignant message, he expresses his longing for her not merely with romantic cliché, but with a specific lament for the conversations and shared studies they are missing. He writes of their learned conversations and shared readings, framing their relationship as an ongoing symposium of two. These epistolary glimpses are powerful because they are incidental. Seneca and Pliny are not trying to make a historical argument for women's intellectual equality. They are simply documenting their daily lives. In doing so, they accidentally preserve the proof. The letters reveal a social reality where, within the sanctum of the elite household, women could be confidantes, critics, and co-thinkers. The medium of the personal letter, with its inherent privacy and direct address, temporarily suspended the formal constraints of gender. It created a narrow but real channel where a mind could speak to another mind, with the titles of husband and wife, or father and daughter, fading into the background. This was the hidden republic of letters, a space where philosophy was not just taught, but exchanged, where a woman's reasoned response was not only possible, but expected. The parchment and ink became the great equalizers, carrying the voices of those whom history's louder narratives tried so hard to silence. Yet for all their resilience and influence, the philosophical world these women inhabited had firm, unyielding walls. The Stoic ideal proclaimed virtue was the same for all rational beings, a universal capacity for wisdom and courage. But the Roman world in which they lived was built on a foundation that treated men and women as fundamentally different in their social and legal capacities. This created a profound tension, a gap between philosophical theory and daily reality. A woman could cultivate a Stoic soul, but she could never step onto the public platform to teach it as a recognized philosopher. The law and custom of Rome simply did not allow it. The title of philosopher, the act of publishing a treatise under one's own name, the leadership of a school, these were male prerogatives, tied to a public identity that women were systematically denied. A man like Musonius Rufus could argue brilliantly for women's philosophical education, but even he could not make his female students his public successors. Their wisdom was meant to illuminate the home, not the forum. This limitation meant that a woman's practice of Stoicism was almost entirely inward and relational. Her arena was not the lecture hall but the household. Her philosophical treatise was not a published scroll, but the way she managed the family's resources with justice, the composure she showed during a child's illness, or the reasoned counsel she offered her husband in private. Her debates were not public disputations, but the quiet conversations held in the garden or over the evening meal. This does not make her practice lesser, but it does make it fundamentally different in its expression. It was a philosophy of application rather than proclamation. The great Stoic tests for these women were not abstract intellectual puzzles about the nature of the good, but concrete, often painful, life events: the death of a child, the exile of a husband, the management of a vast estate alone, or the maintenance of dignity within a stifling marriage. They exercised their reason not to win an argument, but to navigate a world that offered them limited agency. Their courage was not displayed on a battlefield, but in the daily fortitude required to uphold their principles within a structure that often confined them. This is why their stories are so powerful. They represent philosophy under pressure, wisdom tested not in theory, but in the intimate, high-stakes laboratory of lived experience. They prove that the core of Stoicism, the governance of one's inner world, could flourish even when the outer world imposed severe constraints. Their legacy is a testament to the human spirit's ability to find a form of freedom within necessity, to practice an ideal of universal virtue inside a world that was anything but universal in its opportunities. This hidden history of Stoic women is not a closed chapter, but a story being actively rewritten in our own time. For decades, the popular revival of Stoicism drew almost exclusively from the writings of Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Their works offered a powerful toolkit for modern life, but the conversation felt, in a subtle way, incomplete. It was a dialogue among men about a philosophy presented as universally applicable, yet illustrated through a distinctly male experience of power, politics, and public duty. The resilience of a soldier on a frontier, the ethical dilemmas of an emperor, the reflections of a former slave-turned-teacher, these were powerful, but they represented only one set of stages upon which the Stoic drama could be performed. Where were the models for the resilience required not on a battlefield, but in a household under threat? Where were the examples of integrity tested not in the Senate, but in the private upholding of banned ideals? Contemporary scholars, many of them women, began asking these very questions. They returned to the ancient sources with a new lens, looking not for the grand narratives of political history, but for the quiet clues in personal letters, legal documents, and passing mentions. Their meticulous work is slowly pulling figures like Arria, Fannia, and Paulina from the footnotes and into the center of the philosophical discussion. At the same time, popular writers and speakers within the modern Stoic community have begun to integrate these recovered stories. The narrative is expanding. We now hear references not just to the discipline of Marcus Aurelius, but to the political fortitude of Fania. We discuss not only the exile of Seneca, but the steadfast partnership of Paulina that made his philosophical life possible. This is not about replacing one set of heroes with another. It is about correcting a historical blind spot, revealing that the Stoic path was never a single road walked only by men in sandals and togas. It was a network of interconnected trails, some very public, and many more that were private, domestic, and walked by women. This recovery matters profoundly for anyone who finds value in Stoicism today. It demonstrates with tangible evidence that the philosophy's core principles are not gendered. The capacity for courage, justice, wisdom, and self-control does not reside in one half of humanity. The stories of these women prove that Stoicism was practiced, lived, and relied upon by people across the full spectrum of Roman life. They are not presented as perfect plaster saints. They were complex individuals who faced impossible choices, who felt fear and grief, and who sometimes made decisions that from our distant vantage point seem extreme. Their value lies not in their perfection, but in their proof of concept. They show us real people navigating the severe constraints of their world, using Stoic principles to find a footing, to make meaning, and to act with honor. This enriches our modern understanding of key Stoic ideas. Resilience is not only the grit of a soldier, it is also the long endurance of Fannia through years of exile. Duty is not only an emperor's responsibility to the state, it is a mother's reasoned formation of her child's character, or a wife's commitment to a shared philosophical life. Integrity is not only refusing a tyrant's order in public, it is safeguarding the writings of the dissenters when doing so is a crime. By recovering these dimensions, Stoicism becomes a more complete, more deeply human philosophy. It speaks more clearly to the full range of human experience, to the struggles for agency and dignity that happen in quiet rooms as much as in public squares. It reminds us that the inner citadel can be built and defended anywhere, under any circumstances. The tradition is not diminished by their inclusion. It is immeasurably strengthened, offering a richer, more diverse tapestry of human excellence from which we can all learn. Their stories reveal a profound and overlooked truth about Stoicism in Rome. It was not a philosophy sustained by a few great men in isolation, but a vibrant ecosystem, and women were its essential, often hidden life force. They were its practitioners in the domestic sphere, turning the home into a school for virtue. They were its transmitters, safeguarding the writings and legacies of dissidents when it was dangerous to do so. They were its supporters, providing the financial patronage and physical refuge that allowed philosophical communities to survive. And most powerfully, they were its embodied examples, living out the principles of courage, justice, and resilience in the high-stakes theater of their own constrained lives. The fact that their names are not as familiar as those of Seneca or Marcus Aurelius is a flaw in the historical record, a consequence of who held the pens that wrote the official chronicles. It is not, however, a reflection of their philosophical significance. The omission is a historical artifact, not a philosophical truth. Stoicism, at its core, declared virtue to be universal, a capacity of all rational beings. The recovered lives of these women are the ultimate proof of that claim. They demonstrate that the inner citadel could be built and defended anywhere, from a senator's villa to an imperial prison cell, from a quiet garden to a place of exile. Seeking out these marginalized voices does more than just correct the historical ledger. It enriches our understanding of the philosophy itself. It shows us the full spectrum of human experience to which Stoic wisdom can speak, offering models of strength that resonate across different kinds of struggle and constraint. This act of recovery invites us to look beyond the canonical texts in any tradition we study, to ask whose voices were preserved and whose were left in the margins. What other insights have we missed because we only listened to the loudest voices in the room? For anyone drawn to Stoic principles today, these stories offer a more complete inheritance. They remind us that the practice of wisdom is not confined to any single role or circumstance. It is available in the choices we make every day, in how we meet our personal challenges, support those around us, and uphold our own integrity, regardless of who is watching. The journey of these women from the footnotes to the center of the conversation is still unfolding, and it invites each of us to explore their histories further and to consider, in our own lives, how we might apply these timeless principles with the same quiet determination they once did.